Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to start to look at some of the multi-user aspects of Access 2013. In the previous couple of sections we looked at how to split an Access database, and that means that a number of users can use their own front-end database to access a shared back-end database. Now I'm going to set aside for one moment the security issues related to this. We'll come back to those a little bit later on. We're primarily concerned here with the situation where you've got a number of users looking at the same data and the sort of ways that what they do might conflict. And we're going to start by looking at some of the most important access options that relate to these multi-user issues. Now, before I go too much further, I'd like to point out one or two very important things here. Getting the balance right is very important. If you're dealing with a database with a small number of users, with a small turnover of data, what sometimes is referred to as churn of data, and small volumes of data, you're dealing with a very different situation to one where you have large numbers of users, high churn of data, and a lot of data, very large volumes of data. The complexity of the database may also make a difference. And the most important thing is to get this balance right. There isn't one formula for this that applies to all databases. So let's look at some of these all-important options. We'll start by going into File, Options, Client Settings, and then scroll down to Advanced. Now it's important to point out that these are the default settings. These are not settings related to one particular user or one particular database. They're the default settings for this installation of Access on this client PC. First of all, the default open mode is either shared or exclusive. Almost without exception this will be set to shared, and that means that by default when you open an Access database it will be open shared, so other people can access that database at the same time. There may be a situation perhaps in your workplace where your rule is that only one person has a database open at a time, and there you may want your default open mode to be exclusive. In that situation, of course, once somebody's got a database open, nobody else is going to be able to open it. But I must emphasize these are default settings. The fact that you've got shared as the default here doesn't mean that a user may not specifically open a database exclusively, particularly for instance to do maintenance or administration on a database, or perhaps to deal with a problem. It's quite normal for somebody to open a database with exclusive access, having already got all of the other users out of the database. They then open it exclusively to stop anybody else doing it until they've done the maintenance or fixed the problem or whatever. It's very unlikely that your default open mode will be anything other than shared. Oh, and by the way, if you want to know how to open a database exclusively, it's pretty straightforward. Go into the regular Access Open dialog. On the Open button there's a drop down the right hand end. There's the Open for a regular open. Open exclusive. Of course you'll only be able to open exclusive if nobody else actually has the database open at that time. So if you are doing maintenance and you've got a team of people that normally access the database, you'll need to make sure that they're all off. And you can also do an open exclusive read only, which obviously gives you exclusive access but read only access. The next option is probably the most important one of the lot here, and that's default record locking. Bear in mind this is the default value, and there are many situations where you'll want to vary from this default. But let's talk about record locking in general. There are basically three options: no locks, all records, and edited record. So let's suppose that somebody's going to go in and take a look at the record for the movie Casablanca in our movies database, and potentially they're going to make some changes to it. Perhaps they got some additional information. Now while they're doing that, do we stop other people looking at that record? Do we stop other people being able to at least start making changes to that record? Well, if we decide not to apply locks, i.e. we choose the first option there, no locks, we're using what's called optimistic locking. And with optimistic locking we work on the principle that we're not going to lock other people out, because either we think it's so unlikely that that happens that we don't want to stop people being able to read a record generally, even though somebody may be working on it. Or if there was some kind of conflict and two people tried to change the record at the same time, the consequences of that are not important enough to make it inconvenient to users in general to not be able to look at that record while somebody's working on it. Now, the reality of the situation is that even if you adopt optimistic locking, i.e. you don't apply locks, you may well still write VBA code to ensure that if two people do try to change a record at the same time, possibly with changes that conflict with each other, you will still track that, you will still realize that this has happened, and you will take appropriate action. But the basic principle of optimistic locking is that you don't lock people out. Now, one of the situations in which you might use the no locks option is the situation where primarily what's happening is that data is being added to the database. There is very little going on by way of changes to the existing records. And that's an example of how the purpose of a database, or how it's being used at a particular time, might influence the choice of record locking. Now let's look at the second option, all records. This option is not often used. Basically what happens is that when somebody tries to edit one record, all records in that table are locked. Note that the locking applies to the table. This is a bit of a drastic option. It's sometimes used in situations where somebody needs to do some admin on a table. And basically, in order to lock out users from using the table and not lock them out altogether from using the database by, say, opening the database exclusively, what they do is they start work on a record or some records in a table, and that automatically locks other people out of doing anything with the records in that table. The third option is edited record. And the principle of edited record is that when a user selects a record, they open a record, potentially to make changes to it, that record and that record alone are locked. Now I'll come back to that record alone in just a moment. This is usually called pessimistic locking. The assumption is that somebody else might look at that record while the changes are in progress, and we're going to stop them being able to make changes themselves. This is a safer way of doing updates, but it can be frustrating, particularly if the person who gets the record lock is slow about making the changes, or perhaps leaves a particular page on the database open, so the lock is there, but they maybe go off and have a coffee or something, and they're locking other people out. It may still be necessary to write code to deal with these situations, but this approach is the one that's really geared up towards a situation where you are doing updates rather than just adding records. And this is generally referred to as pessimistic locking, the basis of it being that you believe that there is a reasonable chance that somebody else will want to make a change to a record that you are changing. Now below those is a little checkbox here, open databases by using record level locking. I just need to briefly explain that to you. When Access is dealing with information from a database table, it actually handles it in what are called pages. These are 4K, basically 4,000 bytes of data at a time. And one page may contain many records. If you have this box checked, open databases by using record level locking, then what that means is that Access will work on one record at a time, which does slightly slow it down because within a page which may have several records in it, Access needs to know specifically which part of that page relates to your record. If you uncheck that box, then it uses what's called page level locking, and all that Access does is to lock every page that's got some of that table record that you have locked in it. So basically it says the record that you want is in that page. I'm just going to lock the whole page. So other records may be locked at the same time. Now if you have a performance problem on updates, you can try unchecking that box and using page level locking, but for most people that won't be necessary, and you can leave it at the default of record level locking. Now what I'm going to do in a moment is to demonstrate record locking, but before I do, I just want to look at some of these numbers in this section here. A pair of numbers, the third one and the fifth one, number of update retries and update retry interval. These specify how often and how many times Microsoft Access will try to save a record that is locked by another user. So if you need to increase that number of update retries, you think that you're getting conflicts and people are losing their updates, you can increase the number of retries. You can also increase or decrease the interval between retries to save changes. And another very important pair of numbers are refresh interval in seconds, the second one, and ODBC refresh interval, the fourth one, also in seconds. Notice that the ODBC refresh interval by default is 1500 seconds, which is 25 minutes. These two settings control how often Access refreshes your data. Now the data might be in a datasheet, it might be on a form, but it's data that already exists. It doesn't change the order of the records in your data set, it doesn't add new records, it just refreshes the data that you've already selected, possibly just the data on one form. So having that refresh happen means that if somebody does make changes, you will see those changes over a period of time updated in what you can see on the screen. So let's see what record locking actually looks like in practice. I'm back at the movie database here, and of course you may have several forms in a database that do different things even to one table. In the movie database we have a form which we use to basically browse through the movies, and then we can make changes to them as well. Now in order to try edited record locking, what I'm going to do is to change this movie maintenance form so that it uses edited record locking. So F11 just to bring up the navigation pane. Then let's go down to the forms, and we're going to go to movie maintenance. Then we're going to go into design view for that form, and then one of the options on the data tab here is record locks, no locks. Let's change that from no locks to edited record. Save the changes. Now having made that change, I need to provide a copy of this front end to two users, and then what I'm going to do is to get one of the users to use this form and access the record for the movie Casablanca. So let's look at one or two of the things that can happen in the situation where we have this edited record locking. We have two users, each obviously accessing the same database but using their own front end. They're both using a movie maintenance form in which record locking has been set at edited record. Let's suppose that I'm just browsing through the movies in this database. I get to Casablanca, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, I'm actually going to make a change to that. I don't think that it was 1942, I think it was 1943, which of course is wrong, but never mind. Now while I'm thinking about making that change, another user has gone through and actually made a change to it. So I say, okay, I'm going to now, that definitely wasn't 42, it was 1940. So I click on a key to make a change, and what happens is that little no entry sign appears there. It isn't the most obvious thing in the world, but you normally get an audible message as well that says basically you can't change this record, and the reason you can't change this record is because somebody else has changed it while you've been looking at it. And then one variation on this is one where I get to the Casablanca record and I'm sitting there looking at it thinking, I'm sure that's not right. And even in the time that it's taken me to look at that record and think, I'm sure that's not right, I'm sure it was 1943, somebody else actually makes a change to that record. Now I mentioned earlier on the refresh interval, and I would see that change after say 60 seconds, it would appear on my screen. But supposing I decide to make my change just an instant after the other person has made their change, let's see what happens. You get this message: the data has been changed. Another user edited this record and saved the changes before you attempted to save your changes. Re-edit the record. So click on OK, and I can now see the change that the other user made. They changed the date to 1941. That's basically edited record locking in action. I suggest you try that. You could also try the all records locking as well and just see how drastic that is. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.